looking at Exodus, this is what the youth will be studying for Bible Bowl for lads leaders. Kind of start lating it. We're late starting it. But we won't look at the last number of chapters with the detail as the first few chapters. Oftentimes when you start a book, you think in terms of kind of an introduction. You know, what are some general things to see about the book itself? Well, one thing is to just see overall, here's what the book's about. Now, I've put this on the PowerPoint because, frankly, I realize as I read through this, it's a lot easier for you to read through it as well versus you just listening to me. First, there's that prologue, the growth of Israel into a nation. And then you read about Jacob and his descendants. And then the tremendous increase of the children of Israel. And then efforts on the part of a king that did not know Joseph to stop Israel's growth. And then the deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage. This happened by the birth of Moses. Of course, Moses slays an Egyptian and flees into Midian. Then Israel cries for deliverance, and that elicits then the call of Moses. Of course, you remember the burning bush. Moses' first request of Pharaoh and his response, you read about that in chapter 5 and chapter 6. And then you read about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. But as you get to chapter 12, you read the institution of the Passover, the 10th plague, and the hasty departure. You read then about Moses, Miriam, and the children of Israel who sing a song of deliverance. Then Israel continues her journey to Mount Sinai. Then you read about the encampment at Mount Sinai and the giving of the 10 Commandments. God talks to Moses about his covenant with Israel. Moses instructs the people to prepare. Moses goes upon Mount Sinai to receive the law. Then you read the 10 Commandments there in chapter 20. And you read about the book of commandment that contains a lot more than just the 10 Commandments and quite a number of statutes. You read about the acceptance and the ratification of the covenant, chapter 24. And then from 25 to 40, you read about the tabernacle and its furniture. God commands an offering to be taken for the tabernacle. And God gives a pattern for building of the tabernacle and its furniture and then the worship therein. But there's that rebellion and the golden calf. The historical account of the construction of the tabernacle and its furniture, chapters 35 to 39. And then the setting up of the tabernacle and the placing of the furniture there in chapter 40. And that gets you through the book itself. That's the basic content of the book. Now, if you would say the narrative part, the story part, well, that would be kind of chapters 1 through 20 somewhat. But the more instructional and the more specific as concerns the tabernacle and worship and the laws given, 20 to the end of the chapter. Now, another very interesting thing is the typology that you would find within the book of Exodus. This is a paragraph or two from Furman Curley. Many of you remember Furman Curley. He had Montgomery roots, but for a time he was editor of the Gospel Advocate. He wrote, the books of Exodus sets forth the type, and the New Testament sets forth the antitype. The bondage or slavery in Egypt is a clear type of people's bondage and slavery and sin. Moses is a clear type of Christ as he came to redeem all men from sin. Israel being baptized in the cloud and in the sea is a type of Christians' baptism. And the book of Hebrews, especially chapter 9, points out that the articles of furniture in the tabernacle itself were typologically of great spiritual aspects of Christianity. The outer court is a type of the world. The holy place is a type of the church. The most holy place, a type of heaven. The laver of washings was surely a type of baptism. And the table of showbread, a type of the Lord's Supper. And the candlestick is a type of the light brought by Christ and the Word of God, which sends forth the light of God. And the altar in the holy place is a type of our living sacrifices that we must make to God. The ark and the mercy seat in the most holy place are a type of Christ, serving as our high priest to make sacrifice and offering once for all our sins by the shedding of His blood. Now I realize that these last 3 slides, for some people, that's exciting stuff. For other people, not as much. But it's something that I wish everyone would certainly be exposed to, know, be aware of. And it kind of sets the stage for what's ahead with regards to Exodus and things you'll see in its relationship to us in the New Testament. Now, the writer of Exodus is Moses. Now, most conservative scholars do not question this. And it wasn't until about 250 years ago or so that some men did begin to question the authorship of Exodus and if it was Moses or not. Well, there's a big problem with this if you believe in Jesus. You see, Jesus lets us know it was Moses. The Old Testament, the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book, recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." So, here, Moses wrote in a book. Exodus 20:22, and the Lord said to Moses, "You should say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven." Again, evidence of His being author. As I mentioned, Jesus and Moses. And by the way, in John chapter 5, 45 through 47, this would reference Exodus. There's another passage we'll notice that references Exodus. However, there's other passages that would reference other books that Moses wrote, Genesis through Deuteronomy, which, once again, I think gives verification even for Exodus. You read there in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 45. "Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, of whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" It's just kind of this way. If you're not going to believe that Moses was the writer, you've got to disbelieve Jesus. Find in Mark 12:26. "And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." That is referencing Exodus chapter 3, verse 16. And it refers to this as being in the book of Moses. Once again, if you don't believe that Moses wrote Exodus, you're not believing Jesus. Now, as you get to the book itself, you find Israel is in Egypt. These years spent in Egypt were considerable. You read in Genesis 15:13, one of the promises to Abraham. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Now at this juncture in time, no, they're not there. In fact, Abraham, he doesn't go to Egypt to live that and remain there. No, that's going to come later. In fact, there's got to be Isaac born, then Jacob called Israel, and only then with his 12 sons. After Joseph has been sold into Egyptian slavery, and there's those 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, only then and only then we find all of Abraham's descendants moving down to Egypt. Now I know someone might ask the question, well, why? Why did he say you're going to go there for 400 years? You know, I think there's a lot of interesting things that circle around that question. As you would consider where they were living at that time, well, they were living amongst Canaanites. In fact, Esau, that's kind of among the people he got his wives and kind of vexed his mother. And it was a very idolatrous people. And there's the element, okay, how do we keep this people distinct and separate? After all, from them's got to be a nation, and from that nation even comes Jesus. So how are we going to keep them distinct and separate? And how as well are we going to allow them to thrive in this land when you've got all of these idolatrous, not so nice folks around them? So God moved them to Egypt. And you remember they lived separately in the land of Goshen. So you got all the Egyptians, then you got the Israelites. They were separate from the rest. In fact, they really did not assimilate themselves into the life of Egypt. Some that I've read after have suggested that one of the fears of the Egyptians was they've become so many and they haven't assimilated themselves. They've not become like us. They've been here all these years and they've not become Egyptian-like. They've stayed separate. They not only stayed separate, but they went into Israel about 70 to 75 strong. And when they leave, as you read about the number of fighting men, it was about 600,000. And so the estimates about the number of people that leave is about 2 to 3 million. So here in Egypt, they stay separate. They stay loyal to God. They stay separate from the idols of Canaan. They as well stay separate from the idols of Egypt. And they become that great nation. And so when they then go to Canaan, they do have the strength, if they have the faith, to take Canaan. Of course, you remember that story about how the 10 spies, that first go-round, if you would, come back and say, we can't do it. They had the strength. They had God. They didn't have the faith. But then as your second go-round, after that wilderness wanderings, under the leadership of Joshua, they then took Canaan. And they were a nation of people, distinct and separate, and followers of the Almighty God. So here we find them in Egypt. There's another factor about kind of the why in Egypt. There in Genesis 15, those following verses, beginning in verse 14, he says, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." That's the going into Egypt and the coming out. "As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in an old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." It's as if, though they are a sinful people, they're not to the point that God's ready to destroy them. He's going to wait until they get to that point. So He's waiting on the Canaanites to get to that point. He allows Israel to be distinct and become a nation. Now for the next few minutes, let's go to Exodus chapter 1. And I hope you'll just turn there. Exodus chapter 1. And I realize that we're going to just kind of look at some things very fast. And what I want us to do is, I want us to see the facts that are here, but I want us to see any application that we might make along the way. He starts with, "These are the names." Now, some translations will say, "but," and if you begin to read almost any commentary, they're going to say, it would have been good if they had translated this "and," because it can be translated "and." And what that does then is it kind of connects Genesis and Exodus. As in Genesis, they just get to Egypt, and these are the names of Israel which came to Egypt. The books, it just flows from continuous timeline. These are the names of the sons of Israel which came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, what God had said to Abraham is happening. They're becoming a great nation. And you have to see within this the providence of God blessing them. They multiplied, grew exceedingly, so that the land was filled with them. Now you find the word multiplied, similar word to that, multiplied, verse 10. And then you find in verse 12 again that word multiplied, showing how they were truly becoming a great nation. How great a nation were they? Well, as we mentioned, as they left Egypt, we're talking about maybe 2 to 2.5 million to 3 million people leaving. Some people have estimated that the Egyptians themselves only numbered about 2 to 3 million. So what you're talking about is this distinct group of people, strong. The place was full of them. It's like, and there are as many of them as us. So verse 8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He did not know Joseph. I heard someone say this, that humans are more quickly to forget the good others have done for them than the bad that others have done to them. Sad, but all too true. You know, this is starting with a forget. Did not know Joseph. Let's get over to chapter 2, verse 24. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered. In chapter 13, in verse 3, you read, then Moses said to the people, remember. You get to Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day. So while it starts off with a ruler in Egypt forgetting, there's a lot of remembering going on in Exodus. Well, verse 9, he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the land. Now notice, they are mighty in number, but it's very unlikely that they have been taught the skills of war at this juncture, and it's also very likely that they don't have weapons. And so only in joining with the enemies are they truly posing a threat to the Egyptians. But in order to prevent this from happening, we find that there's harsh treatment against the Israelites by Egypt. In verse 11, they set taskmasters over them. Now notice this, to afflict them with heavy burdens. And then it says they built for Pharaoh some cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, God's providence. And the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in the dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made Israel work as slaves, made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all the work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So verse 11 through verse 14 is very clear the harsh treatment that the Israelites received. But it just goes from bad to worse, because you get down to verse 15, and then we read about the killing of the little children, the boys. It said, then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, and I'm told that this could be translated Hebrew midwives in the sense of the midwives were Hebrews, or the idea of the Hebrews of midwives, or the midwives. I am getting my thoughts and my tongue so tangled, so I hope you'll listen to what I intend to say rather than the way I'm saying it. We translated kind of two ways, though every translation I consulted said Hebrew midwives, which leads you to think that the midwives themselves were Hebrew, but it could have been the midwives for the Hebrews, and in which case it was midwives for the Hebrews. It might kind of imply that these midwives were not Hebrews. And there are some things within this section that kind of make you kind of think maybe these midwives were not Hebrews themselves. They were midwives for the Hebrews. It mentions two of the names, Shiphrah and the other Puah. Then verse 16, when you serve as the midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, she shall live. And I said bad to worse. The harsh treatment's bad enough, but now you start killing all the baby boys, far worse. Now some have said, well, why the boys and not the girls? Well, the boys, if there was a war or an uprising, it would be those boys who have grown to be men who'd be the most dangerous. Additionally, maybe it was thought that if we kill out all the boys, then the girls grow up to be women, then maybe they'll marry Egyptians and assimilate amongst the Egyptian society. For whatever reason, he says, you kill the boys. And then it says, but the midwives feared God, did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. People usually fear those who are more powerful. The only way not to fear those who are powerful people is to fear God. And at this juncture, fear of man is slavery, and fear of God is liberating. I don't know if I hear it quite as much now, but I know that over my lifetime I've heard people speak of a godly man as a God-fearing man. Y'all have heard that too, I imagine. God-fearing man. Well, these women, these midwives, were God-fearing women. Hebrews, maybe. Maybe not. But if they were not, they'd come to learn about God, and they feared God, refusing to kill those baby boys. So verse 18, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. And then the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, but they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. It's kind of like saying, well, us Egyptian women, kind of delicate, they need the midwives. These Hebrew women, they're strong, they're vigorous, and they just go ahead and give birth quickly before we get there. Now, then oftentimes questions might come up here in verse 8, in verse 19. Were the midwives lying? Well, in verse 17, it said they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Sounds like they helped them give birth. Could there have been some women who gave birth quickly and they were not present? I would think so. So maybe, could we call it a half-truth? half lie. Then we read in verse 20, so God dealt well with the midwives. Well, I've read where people spoke of this as a moral lie. That's the way they termed it. Verse 19. Call it a moral lie. I don't think we have to conclude such. And even when verse 20 says, so God dealt well with the midwives, I think we could conclude not that necessarily he was saying it's good that you lie, rather that it's good that you let the male children live. And for that they were blessed. And then the people, once again you have that word multiplied. Here you have it 5 times, multiplied or multiplying within this section. Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile. You shall let every daughter live. That's that first chapter. And a little bit of an introduction. And you cannot help but be in awe of the providence of God. How he takes this group of 70 to 75, turns them into a nation. How he makes them strong. And then even how in the midst now of harsh treatment, he continues to protect them. And that just gets us started. If we could assist you with your obedience tonight, if it's a matter of you wish to put the Lord on in baptism, if there's a need for prayer, we would gladly assist you at this time. If you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.